Veronica never expected to die that morning. One moment, she was reaching for a glass of water, then darkness swallowed her whole. But death wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. She watched her lifeless body from above, felt herself pulled into an abyss where tormented whispers surrounded her. Just as fear consumed her, a blinding light shattered the void. Jesus stood before her. What he revealed next about the future and the mark would change everything.
For most of my life, I never imagined I would be writing these words. My name is Veronica, and I once lived a life of quiet devotion, far removed from the chaos of the world. I had given myself fully to God, taking my vows as a nun at a young age. My days were spent in prayer, service, and solitude, seeking only to grow closer to Christ. The world outside our convent moved at a frantic pace, but I was content in my calling, to help the poor, care for the sick, and intercede for those who had lost their way. I had never questioned my purpose. I trusted that God would guide my steps, that He had placed me exactly where I needed to be. My life was not one of grandeur or recognition, but I found peace and simplicity. The worries of the world, money, ambition, power, meant nothing to me. My only concern was faith. But what happened to me changed everything. If someone had told me that one day I would die and return with a message of urgency, I would have dismissed it. I had read accounts of near-death experiences, but they always seemed distant, like stories meant for others, not for me. And yet, that cold morning, I faced the unimaginable. It began with a weakness I couldn't explain. For days, I had felt tired, my limbs heavy, my breath short. I ignored it, assuming it was exhaustion from fasting and long hours of prayer. I had lived a disciplined life, often pushing my body beyond its limits in devotion to God. I believed He would sustain me, as He always had. That morning, I awoke before dawn, as I had done every day for years. The rain tapped softly against my small window, the air inside my room damp and cold. I reached for my Bible, but my hands trembled, an odd numbness spreading through my fingers. I shook it off and stood, but my legs felt unsteady beneath me. Something was wrong. I told myself I just needed water, a moment to gather my strength. But as I reached for the glass on my bedside table, my vision blurred. The room tilted, my chest tightening as if a great weight pressed down upon me. My breath came in short gasps. The glass slipped from my grasp, shattering against the floor. Then, the world around me began to fade. I tried to steady myself, gripping the edge of the wooden table, but my legs gave out beneath me. The last thing I remember was the cold floor meeting my body, the distant sound of footsteps rushing toward my door, and a voice, muffled, urgent, calling my name. Then nothing. Darkness. At that moment, my life as I knew it ended. But my journey was only beginning. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an absence of everything. No pain, no breath, no weight. Just stillness. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, trapped in that strange place between sleep and waking. But as my senses returned, I realized the truth. I was no longer in my body. I could see myself lying on the cold stone floor of my room, my robes pooled around me. My skin looked pale, my lips slightly parted as if I had tried to speak before I fell. My chest did not rise or fall. I was utterly still. Then I heard it, the frantic voice of my neighbor, Elena. "Oh, dear Lord, please, someone help," she cried, her voice thick with panic. She stood in the doorway, her face pale with fear, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. I should have felt something, panic, urgency, desperation to call out and tell her I was still here. But I didn't. Instead, a strange detachment settled over me. It was as if I were watching a scene from someone else's life. I tried to move, to step forward, but I had no feet, no legs, no hands to reach out with. And yet, I was aware, more aware than I had ever been before. Then, something unseen pulled me. It wasn't a force I could resist. It wasn't hands gripping me, but rather an invisible current tugging at the core of my being, drawing me upward. I rose effortlessly, weightless, as though gravity no longer applied to me. My small room, the shattered glass on the floor, Elena's frantic cries, everything faded beneath me. I passed through the ceiling as if it weren't there, moving higher and higher into something vast and unfamiliar. Then, the world I had known disappeared completely. Darkness surrounded me. Not the darkness of a moonless night, nor the gentle dimness of a candle flickering out. This was deeper, heavier, almost alive. It pressed against me, vast and endless, stretching beyond what my mind could comprehend. At first, there was silence. Then came the whispers. At first, they were distant, soft, almost mournful. But they grew louder, multiplying, overlapping. The voices were filled with sorrow, regret, and something far worse, despair. Some cried out in pain. Others pleaded. Some raged in fury. I tried to turn, to see where the voices were coming from, but I had no sense of direction. I was suspended in the void, a soul without a body, a mind without a form. A terrible realization settled in me. Was this hell? Was I being judged? I had spent my life in service to God, in prayer and devotion. And yet, I had never been perfect. I had doubted, I had questioned, I had failed. Was that why I was here? Was I being condemned? The thought sent a ripple of fear through me, and as if in response, the voices grew more urgent. The darkness around me deepened, thickening like a storm gathering its strength. I wanted to cry out, but I had no mouth. I wanted to run, but I had no feet. Then, from the depths of the void, something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a shape. It was a presence, immense, overwhelming, and suffocating. I could feel it watching me, though I could see nothing. The whispers turned into wails. Terror gripped me.
Dear God, help me.
And then I saw it. A light. It was faint at first, no larger than a distant star, but it pierced through the darkness with an intensity that made the shadows recoil. The moment I saw it, the voices faltered. The suffocating presence hesitated. The light began to grow, expanding outward, spilling warmth over me like a wave of golden fire. The darkness screamed. I felt something breaking, as though unseen chains had been wrapped around me and were now snapping apart. The light drew closer, and I knew I was not alone. Someone was coming for me, and in that moment I understood. I was being rescued. The light engulfed me, burning away the shadows that had threatened to consume me. Warmth, unlike anything I had ever known, washed over me, filling every part of my being. The sorrowful whispers faded, replaced by a profound stillness. Then I saw him. At first, he was only a figure in the distance, standing at the center of the radiant glow. As he drew closer, I felt something indescribable, an overwhelming presence that was both powerful and tender. His very being exuded love, sorrow, and something else, urgency. Jesus. The moment I saw him, I knew. Every fiber of my existence recognized him, not just as a man, not just as a teacher, but as the Alpha and the Omega, the living God. His eyes, deep and piercing, held the weight of eternity, and yet they were filled with compassion as he looked at me. I fell to my knees, not because I chose to, but because I could do nothing else. In his presence, all I had ever known paled in comparison. My past, my prayers, my sacrifices, they all seemed like a mere whisper in the wind before the vastness of his glory. For what felt like an eternity, I could not speak.
But I didn't need to.
He knew everything. Finally, he extended his hand. His voice was both gentle and unshakable, resonating deep within me. You must see. At his words, the light around us shifted. The warmth dimmed, and suddenly, I was no longer standing before him. I was somewhere else. A city stretched before me, vast and gleaming, filled with towering buildings, blinking lights, and people moving about in eerie synchronization. Everything was ordered, efficient, and controlled. I looked closer. At first, it seemed peaceful. But then I noticed the subtle details, The way the people walked, their faces devoid of joy, their movements mechanical. It was as if something vital had been stripped from them. Then I saw the mark. A small insignia, barely noticeable, either on the right hand or the forehead. It was everywhere, on billboards, on digital screens, on the glowing kiosks where people scan their hands to enter buildings, buy food, or access transportation. No one questioned it. No one resisted. The realization hit me like a wave of ice. This was not just some political system or economic program. This was something far, far deeper. The mark was not forced on people. They took it willingly. They embraced it. And in doing so, they had given up something precious, something eternal. Jesus' voice resonated within me again, sorrowful yet firm. They will be told they have no choice, but I will provide. His words settled over me like a weight. The people in this vision had chosen the mark not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of hunger, fear of rejection, fear of losing their place in the world.
The scene changed. Now I saw the other side. Those who had refused the mark.
They were not part of the gleaming cities.
They were outcasts.
I saw a mother standing in a marketplace, her children clinging to her side. She held out a handful of cash to buy bread, but the vendor shook his head, pointing to a scanner. She had no mark, therefore she had no right to buy. Tears filled her eyes as she pulled her children away, empty-handed. I saw a man in a hospital, pleading for medicine for his wife. The doctor shook his head. No mark, no treatment. I saw entire families being evicted from their homes, forced into the streets because they refused to comply. And then I saw the hunters, those who had been assigned to find the unmarked and bring them into re-education centers. They weren't soldiers. They were neighbors.
Friends.
Even family members. The world had turned against them. Society called them dangerous, extremists, enemies of progress. It was not merely persecution. It was a total rejection of their right to exist. Then the vision shifted once more. I saw those who had taken the mark. At first, they seemed unchanged. But then I looked into their eyes. They were empty. At first, it was subtle, a dullness, a lack of light. But as time passed, they became hollow. Their emotions faded. Their love for their families disappeared. I saw a woman who had once held her infant child with tenderness now turn away as if the baby were nothing. I saw a husband reject his wife, who had refused the mark as though she were a stranger. They had surrendered something far greater than their freedom. They had surrendered their souls. The vision dissolved, and I found myself standing before Jesus once more. My heart was pounding. Tears burned my eyes. I wanted to beg him to undo it, to stop it from happening, to change what I had seen. But he only looked at me with sorrow. It has already begun. I opened my mouth to protest, but he raised his hand. Tell them. His voice was like thunder, yet filled with love. Warn them. The time is short. I could barely speak. But how will they survive without the mark? His gaze softened. The world will say they have no choice, but I will provide. At that moment, I understood. This was not just a battle of survival. This was a test, a final, eternal choice. The mark was not just a tool of control. It was spiritual submission. The vision began to fade. The light around him grew blinding. I felt myself being pulled back towards something familiar, something painful, something human. I gasped, and I awoke. The vision did not end. Even as the scene of the hollow-eyed masses faded, I was drawn into another. This time, the world looked different, darker, colder. The air itself felt heavier, thick with a silent oppression. But this was not the city where the marked lived. This was where the unmarked had gone. I saw them, men, women, children, those who had refused the mark. They were scattered, wandering through desolate streets, huddled together in abandoned buildings, hiding in forests and mountains where they could no longer be found. Their clothes were worn, their faces gaunt from hunger, yet in their eyes, there was something the marked had lost, a light, a presence. I saw a man, once a respected doctor, now digging through trash for scraps of food. He had been stripped of everything, his name erased from every record, his credentials revoked. I saw a young woman, once a teacher, sitting outside a church that had long been shut down. She clutched a small Bible, her fingers trembling as she read by the dim light of the moon. I saw an elderly couple, once surrounded by their children and grandchildren, now alone. Their own family had turned them in, calling them dangerous for refusing the mark. The world had turned against them. Society had decided they no longer deserved to exist. At first, those who refused the mark tried to stay in the cities, believing they could survive quietly, unnoticed. But the system did not allow for neutrality. The unmarked were quickly identified. Without the mark, they could not buy food, rent homes, or even receive medical care. Banks shut down their accounts. Employers dismissed them. They became ghosts, forced out of society. Many fled. I saw small groups forming in the wilderness, hidden communities of believers. They gathered in forests, in mountains, in underground places where they would not be found. They had no electricity, no stores, no hospitals, but they had faith. Then, something extraordinary happened. I watched as a man knelt by the dry, cracked earth, his hands lifted in prayer. His family stood behind him, their faces weary with hunger. They had not eaten in days. Lord, you fed Elijah in the wilderness. You fed the Israelites with manna. You are the same God. As his voice trembled in the night air, something stirred in the ground. Before their eyes, plants began to sprout, vines thick with fruit, roots deep and strong. Food where there had been none. I saw another group, hiding in a cave, huddled around a child who was burning with fever. They had no medicine, no way to help. A woman laid her hands on the child's forehead, tears slipping from her eyes. Jesus, you healed the sick. You made the blind see. If we cannot turn to the world, we turn to you. At her words, the child gasped. His fever vanished in an instant. But not everyone stood firm. Some hesitated. I saw a man, once bold in his faith, now trembling as he held his starving daughter. How can I let her suffer? He whispered. Surely God would understand if I took the mark just to feed her? Tears filled his eyes as he looked at his wife, hoping she would agree. But she only shook her head. If we lose everything but keep our souls, we have lost nothing. If we gain the world but lose our souls, we have lost everything. The man turned away, wrestling with the decision.
Some would hold on.
Some would give in. And Jesus' words echoed in my soul. They will be told they have no choice, but I will provide. Then Jesus showed me one last thing. I saw a woman standing in the ruins of a small town. She had once been wealthy, powerful, a leader among her people. Now she had nothing. She stood before a government official who offered her one final chance. Take the mark and you can have your life back. Food, shelter, a home. You don't have to suffer anymore. She hesitated. Her hands trembled. Then, with quiet strength, she looked him in the eyes and shook her head. My life is not my own. And then I saw the price of her choice. She was taken away. But as they led her from the town, her face was radiant. And I knew she had not been abandoned. She had been chosen. The vision faded, and I found myself once more standing before Jesus. His eyes were filled with sorrow, but also with hope. The vision shifted again, and I was pulled into the final scene. I stood in the heart of a vast city, but it no longer resembled the world I once knew. Everything was clean, orderly, efficient. Digital screens displayed messages of unity, progress, and peace. The people moved in perfect synchronization, their faces blank, their eyes devoid of light. It was the new world, a world where everyone had accepted the mark. At first glance, it seemed peaceful. There was no crime, no conflict. But as I looked closer, I realized this peace had come at a terrible cost. These people were no longer themselves. I watched as a mother passed by a small child huddled in the corner of an alley. The boy looked up at her, his face streaked with dirt, his hands reaching out. "Mama," he whispered, but she did not stop. She did not even recognize him. She had taken the mark. Her love, Her very soul was gone.
The scene changed.
I was in a remote outpost, far from the cities, where the unmarked had gathered. They were the last ones left, those who had refused to submit. They lived in hiding, surviving on scraps, waiting for what they knew was coming. And then the day arrived. I saw the soldiers approaching, rows of them, marching in perfect formation. Their faces were unreadable, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Behind them stood a man in a suit, calm and composed. "We don't want to harm you," he said, his voice smooth, almost kind. "We want to help you. The world has moved forward. You don't have to suffer anymore." No one moved. Then came the final temptation. The man gestured toward a group of children, frail, hungry, their ribs visible beneath tattered clothing. "Think of your children," he said softly. "Is your pride worth their suffering? Give them a future. Let them eat. Let them live." Some of the parents wept, their hands shaking. Some stepped forward. A woman, holding a starving baby, sobbed as she whispered, "Forgive me." And she took the mark. Her husband reached for her, but the moment she accepted it, something in her changed. She turned away from him, her eyes suddenly cold. She no longer saw him. She no longer cared. But there were others, those who refused. They stood together, weary but unshaken, their hands clasped in silent prayer. One man, his face gaunt from hunger, stepped forward, not to surrender, but to speak. "You cannot take what belongs to God," he said. "We have already made our choice." The man in the suit sighed. "So be it." The soldiers raised their weapons. And then the sky split open. A light unlike anything I had ever seen poured down, brighter than the sun, brighter than life itself. The soldiers staggered, shielding their eyes. But the unmarked stood tall, their faces illuminated, their burdens lifted. Jesus had come. The vision shattered. A force stronger than anything I had ever known pulled me backward, dragging me through layers of light and darkness. I felt as if I were falling, tumbling through eternity, rushing back towards something familiar, something heavy. Then pain. A sharp gasp tore through my lungs as air rushed in. My chest ached, my limbs felt weak, and my body, my frail, human body, was once again mine. I was back. I heard a voice, urgent, desperate. "Veronica." Oh, thank God. "Stay with me." It was Elena. Her hands gripped mine, her face streaked with tears. The room spun around me, my vision blurred, my body shaking from the effort of simply existing again. I was alive, but I was not the same. I knew why I had returned.
To warn you.
The world is changing. The choice is coming. And it is not just a question of survival. It is a test of faith. I have seen what is coming. I have seen what happens to those who submit, but I have also seen those who stand firm. Jesus is coming soon. And when the time arrives, there will be no middle ground. Only a choice. Will you stand firm, or will you surrender? The time to choose is now.